months of 1918, the world was still slowly recovering from the ravages of the Great War. Cities were rebuilding, families were mourning, and soldiers were returning home to lands forever changed by battle. Yet, in this fragile calm, a new, invisible enemy began to emerge. Unlike the cannons and rifles that had scarred continents, this enemy moved silently, unseen by the human eye, invisible in the wind, in the crowds, in the very air people breathed. It was a virus, a flu strain that would come to be known as the Spanish flu. It began in small, unsuspecting towns. Soldiers, already weakened by the influenza that swept through military camps, were the first to show symptoms. A cough here, a fever there, a fatigue that would not lift. Initially, these were dismissed as minor ailments, perhaps remnants of the war's exhaustion, but soon the virus spread with a speed and severity that no one anticipated. Entire battalions fell ill, hospitals overflowed, and families watched in horror as one by one their loved ones succumbed to this silent, relentless foe. The virus was unusual in its ferocity. Unlike common flu strains, it did not primarily target the very young or the very old. Instead, it struck with terrifying precision at young adults, those who were otherwise strong and healthy. This peculiarity puzzled doctors and nurses who had devoted their lives to healing. Medical knowledge was limited. Antibiotics did not exist, and treatments were often little more than rest, warm liquids, and hope. Masks were improvised. Isolation wards were set up wherever possible. Yet the disease continued to spread, defying all attempts to contain it. Cities began to feel the impact in profound ways. Streets that had once been bustling with life grew quiet. Shops and theatres closed their doors. Schools emptied as children were kept at home, and the usual hum of urban life was replaced by an eerie silence. In some places, entire families were lost within days. Neighbours checked on each other through windows or left supplies at doorsteps, afraid to enter the homes where illness had struck. The world, still weary from years of war, now faced the haunting spectre of a silent pandemic. One of the most striking features of this pandemic was the way information was controlled. Unlike today, when news travels instantly across the globe, newspapers often minimised or delayed reporting on the flu, especially in countries still engaged in the First World War. Leaders feared that widespread panic could further destabilise societies already strained by conflict. Spain, however, remained neutral during the war, and its newspapers reported openly about the outbreak, giving the impression that the disease was particularly severe there. Hence, the world began referring to it as the Spanish flu, even though its origins were elsewhere. Hospitals became sites of desperation. Nurses and doctors worked long hours, often without adequate protective equipment. Many medical staff themselves fell ill, reducing the already thin ranks of caregivers. Makeshift hospitals were established in school gyms, churches, and community halls. Each bed told a story. The young mother whose cough would not subside, the father too weak to rise from his chair, the child with fever burning like a flame. Death arrived quietly, but consistently, and with it, grief so pervasive that communities seemed to shrink in their sorrow. Yet, amidst the despair, stories of resilience and humanity persisted. Families found ways to care for one another. Neighbours shared what little they had, and strangers sometimes became the only support system for those isolated by illness. Letters sent from sick relatives, often too weak to speak, carried words of hope, love, and the determination to survive. tapestry of human strength, a reminder that even in the darkest times, people seek connection and comfort. The Spanish flu did not respect borders. Ships carried the virus across oceans. Soldiers returning from the war brought it to continents far from its initial outbreak. Urban centres in America, Europe, Asia, and Africa reported cases, each community experiencing the pandemic's impact in unique ways. Indigenous populations, often already weakened by historical oppression and poor access to medical care, were hit with devastating consequences. Remote towns and villages, which might have once seemed safe, were not spared, as travellers unknowingly carried the virus into their midst. Interestingly, the flu came in multiple waves. The first wave, mild and relatively unnoticed, was only the beginning. The second wave, which struck later in 1918, was far more lethal. Entire communities were overwhelmed within days. In some regions, mortality rates climbed to extreme levels. Streets were lined with makeshift coffins. Funeral homes struggled to keep pace. The third wave in 1919, though less deadly than the second, still reminded the world that the virus was not yet finished. Humanity was learning to cope, adapt, and endure, slowly, painstakingly. Through all of this, ordinary human lives persisted. Markets reopened as best they could. Children, though weakened in some areas, continued to play quietly in sheltered spaces. Farmers tended to crops, soldiers returned to civilian life, and teachers slowly welcomed students back to classrooms. Life, fragile but persistent, found a way to continue. And in the midst of struggle, people learned lessons about hygiene, public health, and the interconnectedness of global society that would inform generations to come. It is important to remember the scale of this pandemic. Globally, it is estimated that at least 500 million people were infected, roughly 1/3 of the world assessed population at the time. Tens of millions perished. The speed with which the virus spread, combined with the lack of medical countermeasures, created a scenario that seems almost unimaginable today. Yet, despite this, communities showed remarkable adaptability. Citizens organised volunteer groups, made face masks, and implemented rudimentary quarantines. The very act of survival became an exercise in human ingenuity and cooperation. Personal stories from this time reveal the quiet heroism of everyday people. There were fathers who worked tirelessly to care for sick children despite their own deteriorating health. Mothers who, even while battling fever themselves, prepared meals for neighbours. Doctors who documented cases meticulously, often falling ill themselves in the process. These narratives may not dominate history books, but they form the heart of the human experience during the Spanish flu. From a scientific perspective, the 1918 influenza pandemic also offered profound lessons. Researchers later discovered that it was caused by an H1N1 influenza virus with genetic characteristics that allowed it to infect healthy young adults more severely than typical flu strains. The concept of viral mutation, immune response, and public health interventions were all studied intensively after the pandemic, forming the foundation for modern epidemiology. In a way, the silent pandemic reshaped both medical science and social consciousness. As the months passed, the flu eventually receded. Communities mourned their losses, erected memorials, and slowly began to heal. Survivors carried the memory of what had happened, telling stories to their children and grandchildren, ensuring that the lessons of 1918 were not forgotten. It is a reminder that even when silence and invisibility dominate, the human spirit perseveres. Today, over a century of the Spanish flu remain. We reflect not only on the numbers and statistics, but on the lived experiences of individuals and families. The quiet streets, the makeshift hospitals, the whispered reassurances of loved ones, all are part of a story that continues to resonate. And in this reflection, we are reminded of resilience, community, and the importance of caring for one another. So, now as you listen to this story, consider this. How did ordinary people endure one of the deadliest pandemics in human history? What lessons can we carry forward into our own lives as we face challenges that test our strength and patience? Take a moment to reflect, and perhaps in the silence, find inspiration in the courage of those who lived through 1918. Even in silence, history speaks, and in listening, we honour those who came before us.